Hi, and welcome to Faith, Hope, and Love during an election. I'm so happy to have my friend Marlena Graves here with us today. Marlena, do you want to start by just telling who you are? Um, we were just saying before we started taping this that we have been friends for more than 10 years, and both of us used to write for Christianity Today's blog for women, which is called Hermeneutics, and that's how we first met each other. And then now we're part of a writing guild together and have had lots of adventures over the years. So welcome, Marlena. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm smiling so big, my face hurts because I just love you so much. I'm glad to be here. um, you probably asked me already to talk a little bit about myself.
Yeah, talk about the work you do. You could talk about your new book, which just recently launched, The Way Up is Down, Becoming Yourself by Forgetting Yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jen. This book actually is pertinent to our conversation. At least the genesis of the book is pertinent to our conversation today. Um, it came out of my, and I know this is a strong word, but I've used it before and I'll stick by it. It came out of my disgust with evangelical and national politics and Christians that I thought were selling their souls for power, money and power. When I was young, and I talk about this in my first book, A Beautiful Disaster, Finding Hope in the Midst of Brokenness, and I mentioned it in this new book, The Way Up is Down. I was very poor, and I lived in an impoverished area, born in Puerto Rico, but moved to northwestern Pennsylvania, where my dad was from. Eventually, I lived in California for a little bit, but not long. And so I grew up most of my, until my 18 years old, I was in northwestern Pennsylvania, south of Erie, Pennsylvania. And, I always joke that we were like the only Latinas or Latinos in the census, but pretty much probably were. There might have been like 3 in the county. But one of the things I used to do is listen to Christian radio a lot. And there were lots of preachers, on the radio. And a lot of them, I remember in the early, to mid 90s when I was in junior high and high school, talked about how much character mattered, and that character affects our politics. And I saw a lot of these same people prior to the 2016, even years before, just like I said, selling out for money and power. It's almost throwing aside everything that they said in that decade of the 90s and early 2000s.
Family values and all.
Yeah, when like political power went their way, like they point the finger at other people that they thought weren't living according to family values and condemn them. But then when the winds shifted and it looks good for them, then they set aside these, emphases on character, or they said, oh, people get a pass. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Because, I also went to a Christian college where, as has been in the news recently, I don't necessarily have to name it, but where the students at the colleges would be expelled for, having even thought about drinking. I don't drink, but I don't have issue with people that do. I just don't drink for personal reasons. But then the leaders, they do it and they can keep on going, or they overlook sexual abuse in their institutions or in their churches. And because they bring in money, it's almost like they get a free pass, or they say, I'm sorry, and come back a month later. But many people, tons of people at the institutions and the churches have been hurt, and some walk away from the faith because they see the hypocrisy. And so that was the genesis of my book. And basically, I'm like, the church has, the American church, especially, evangelicals have a bad witness, I think, to the culture, to unbelievers, not because we're following Jesus. And I use evangelical broadly. Like when I use it to refer to myself, I'm thinking about Christocentric, but I'm not evangelical by culture. But lots of people are evangelicals, Catholics, Episcopalians, and that Jesus Christ is central. That's the historic use of the word. I guess some people would quibble with me about that. But the people that have the mic in the media that always get interviewed, it's just most all of them seem to have sold out to money and power. And but there are lots of beautiful and good people that aren't on the media and that are loving Christ in their everyday life that aren't seen. And I talk about that in my book. And so that was the genesis, I keep using that word, of why I wrote the book. But basically I was thinking about, how would Jesus live in this time? He doesn't seek money, power, and prestige and influence. Not to say if you have that you can't use it and steward it well. I'm saying that wasn't his final goal. His will was to do the Father's will. And he always did it in a posture of humility, as is talked about in Philippians chapter 2. And that's the title of my book, The Way Up is Down. In the kingdom of God, the way up is humility and allowing God to lift us up in due time, not stepping over people and running over people to get where we think we need to go. In order to do what we believe God has us to do, we have to use God's means for God's ends. We can't say, yes, I'm doing this in the name of God, but treat people like hell, or and abuse them. And I see that going on a lot, and in exchange for power and influence. And that is why I wrote my book. And I actually think, Jesus did not use those things to do what he believed God said to do, which is, not my will, but yours be done. He did not call down fire from heaven to burn people, even though the disciples thought he should. He told Peter to put away his sword. He said, my kingdom's not of this world. And the American church just is not being a good witness to unbelievers, because the unbelievers are like, the little we know about Jesus, we know that he's not like this. So
right. I think you've had some lived experiences that are different than many of us, including your work with people who work at the border. Do you want to talk about that? I mean, I think that relates to what you're saying, because you've seen how the people who are not living with privilege and who are really marginalized by a lot of policies and by the dominant culture and by the dominant evangelical church culture. Do you want to talk about that, your work with people working on farms?
Yes, I until February, I worked for the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, FLOC. They're a agricultural labor union. I think it was in 1936 that farm workers were left out and of any kind of workers' rights, because the farm workers were African American or Latino and Latinx. They were not of the majority culture, and the only way that people would go for the reform with Roosevelt is if they could keep the black and brown people down. So basically they don't have the human rights, labor rights, that a lot of people in the labor unions had. And so FLOC, farm workers, the people that put food on our tables, whenever anything you eat, including, chocolate, tea, milk, wine, it might not be farm workers in America, or it could be a farm worker, in India or in other places on tea plantations. There's so many human rights abuses that have to do with farm work, including child labor, and even in the United States. And so I was able to work with FLOC for a few years. I've been in the field with the farm workers, listen to the farm workers talk about how the many human rights abuses against them. Like, for example, if they said, our bathroom's not working in some instances, they would be retaliated against for complaining against the farmer. Now, it could be the middleman who may or may not be Latino, Latina, or Latinx, but they are corrupt. They would take bribes, and it's just such a often corrupt system for the people that harvest our food, those that do dairy, any kind of vegetables that we have. So 99% of them are from Mexico, but there are some from other Central and South American countries. And they're taken advantage of here in the United States, whether they come on what's called a H-2A visa, or they're undocumented, whether they just brought up without their papers. It really seems to, the ones that have the H-2A visa also have some protections, which we worked with a lot of them at FLOC. Most all the ones we work with have the H-2A visa, but also undocumented, they just do not have protections. Their wages are much lower than they should be. But also it's like the farm workers are paid low wages by the farmers, but the government, it's like a whole global thing. The farmers should be paid more money, and the farm workers should. And you would think that if that happens, it would trickle down out of the goodness of the farmer's heart. Not necessarily. You have to have people to keep them accountable and say, hey, and that's what Flock did. These people need water, they need bathroom breaks. You need to pay them. If they weren't paid what they were due, or all the things that they were guaranteed, Flock was an advocate with a lot of other, there's the United Farm Workers in California, started by Cesar Chavez, who was friends with Baldomor Velasquez, who was my boss. And so like I said, I've been in the fields, I've heard what they've said. And then when and people say to me and the others there, Marlena, pray to God for me, all in Spanish, pray to God for me, pray for my family. Or, they would ask these things, or, saying, I pray to God every day, for my family. They just want to have money to send back to their family members in their countries of origin. And I was talking to someone the other day about something similar to this, but people don't leave their homes because they want to. Usually people will leave their homes because they're under duress. If these farm workers and people that are fleeing, they might be the same people or different, asylum seekers that are fleeing the countries because of an unstable, destabilized society, because dictators and drug cartels are threatening their lives. I've talked to people whose lives have been threatened, women that have been raped. One woman told me they, burned her neighbor's house down and killed her neighbors, and they wanted to basically, I don't know what the word is, confiscate her house. And they said, well, don't call the police, because they threatened her, and she called the police, but the police were in cahoots with the cartel. And so she had to flee with her family. It's just all this bribery. And we always think, oh, those awful other countries. Well, we have corruption in our government, massive corruption. And so I guess one of the last things that I want to say, and I'm going to be studying this more, but the US, I am careful not to blame the United States for everything, because that's foolish. There's lots of good things that people in the United States do. However, in El Salvador, for an example, the United States propped up dictators that murdered their people in the 70s and 80s. I mean, there was massive amounts of people killed in El Salvador, and so we are responsible for their deaths because we wanted, a certain person in power for U.S. interests.
Right.
So massive amounts of people were killed, and with our help, and they came from I forget the
Guatemala. I mean,
yes, all those areas. It's just, and then we're like, why are they fleeing to the United States? I mean, what's your problem? We want to just, I say, throw them away like trash across the border. But we helped destabilize their countries. And I say to people, listen, if I have 3 girls, 13, 8, and almost 6. And I know you have children. You have 4 children. If my children were in danger of their lives, of being raped or given to a cartel to traffic drugs or whatever it was, or we were hungry because the economy was bad, NAFTA in 1993, that Bill Clinton signed, put a lot of Mexican farmers out of work, into poverty, because they couldn't compete with U.S. farmers. And these farm subsidies, which is basically what we would say is a handout, in a derogatory way, because they always say the poor people take handouts, but of course rich people do too. They just call it something different. Economic support, or subsidy. But and I'm not saying, I don't know enough about subsidies to say whether I'm for it or against it, but I'm just saying that farmers get subsidies, bailouts by the government. And so the Mexican farmers couldn't compete with that, and so they started coming to the United States for work. So I think what I want people to understand when I'm talking about this, you said, yes, I have talked to these people in person. I'm not just watching the news, but I'm seeing what's happening on the ground. I have not been to the border, but I've talked to people who have, on their way to a sponsor, they were at the border and telling me what's happening. And I've had friends telling me what the conditions are at the border, and I hope to get there myself to see with my own eyes. But the United States has destabilized other countries and has played a part in the immigration crisis that we have. And then it's like when people try to flee to us for help, we crush them. And I have no qualms about saying that is wrong. It also violates several international human rights laws. I can go into that, but I don't want to get into the nitty gritty. You can look that up yourself. The non-refoulement clause, which means you're not supposed to put, when people flee to a country in because of danger and persecution, seeking asylum, you're not supposed to send them back to the same countries where they just fled from. And we're doing that to children and to families. And so I feel very strongly about it. I think it's wrong. And I think Christians especially are going to be judged for how we treat them and others, African-American people and other marginalized folks, the injustices that we do. But immigration and the situation at the border and asylum seekers and farm workers is kind of where God has put me, and where I know a little bit more about that than say, something else. So.
Right. And it's probably not, these are not, immigration certainly is an issue that people are talking about regarding the upcoming election, but we don't hear much about, in debates or in news stories or whatever, what's happening to farm workers. And I mean, that's always sort of, people don't think about it. I feel so grateful that you've done the work you've done, because by following you and seeing your tweets and following the kind of threads to, for instance, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, I've become more educated around these issues. But yeah, it's not something that you hear, our candidates for president saying, and we need to treat our farm workers better, and we need to make sure they're paid properly, and that could be, I don't know, is that one of the roles that organization plays, is to try to raise awareness in light of the election, in light of what we're asking our elected leaders to do?
I mean, I can't speak for them officially for Flock. Like, obviously we want, or when I worked there, Flock wanted elected leaders to pay attention. But one thing that I learned from working under Valdemar Velasquez is that you cannot wait for legislation to happen, because it's going to be years. You have to basically, not in a nonviolent type of way, but you got to fight for yourself and speak up for yourself. And I think is what Martin Luther King Jr., maybe I'm misquoting him, but other people have said, the oppressors aren't going to stop oppressing you out of their own good heart. You usually, something has to catalyze for oppression to stop. They don't usually stop. Just like the Civil War happened, the civil rights and protests. If you don't speak up and cry out against it, yes, by voting, but also, with your body and protesting, then nothing's going to change.
Right.
The government's not going to do
want to keep it.
Yes, that's right. The people and people that are oppressing people, I mean, if they can get away with it and make money, and keep their positions, they're going to do it, right? Because it's to their advantage. I mean, if it weren't to their advantage, I would think they wouldn't be doing it. But
absolutely. And going back to your book, so can you talk more about how those convictions and experiences informed the book? How did that, do you write about talking with farm workers? Or I haven't gotten to a point in the book yet where that's the case, but
yeah, in the last chapter I talk about Valdemar Velasquez and the influence he's had on me. I didn't write in the book about farm workers. I've written pieces for like Religion News Service and other about my work with farm workers, and I've talked about it a lot. I've spoken about it, but I might in the future. But I think the thing in my book that I talk about is, I mean, I don't know if I say these words, but people talk about, my friend Michelle Warren, the power of proximity and other people. I think that our theology should be grounded in our community, especially our local community. So I am so glad that I'm talking to you. You're in Chicago. I'm in Toledo, Ohio. You're my friend. I love you. I know you do such good work in other things, in a lot of areas. And so like when I worked for the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, yes, I was in the fields with the farmers, but the farm workers, they take out a little bit of money from each of their checks to help fund the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, and the flock would also raise money. But the farm workers wanted us to do just in the communities where the headquarters were. So one's in Toledo, Ohio, one's in Mexico, one's in North Carolina, near the Triangle area, not too far from that. So like we did a lot of work with police brutality here in Toledo, and the kids, the urban youth, African American, Hispanic, and white youth, and I was, I was like, and some people would say, we work in the hood or whatever, but it's like there's these labels that people append on areas. I'm like, there's like really beautiful people that work hard here. Like I never once, I'm not saying nothing bad ever happened, but I never felt scared in the neighborhood. And I think the important thing is to be like the incarnation of Christ, to be there in our body, however you can be. Like, so I can be, and I'm not putting Zoom down. That's not what I mean. This is the technology we have in the pandemic. But I think what brings power is not just like what people talk about, like Twitter justice or advocacy or performative justice. I think what gives power to it's actually being with the people, just like Jesus did. He thought it important enough to come in the flesh. And so in my book, I talk about people that I actually know with their permission. And I try to, I guess that's what's humility, being low to the ground, the dirt, like right on the ground, theology on the ground, and not just intellectualized and in our heads, but lived out. I'm not saying that theology in the head is not important. I love liturgy, and I never want that to go away, but I'm saying it needs to be enfleshed. And I think I try to do that in my book.
Embodied solidarity, that wonderful term.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that too. I liked in your book the way that you reference, like Teresa of Avila and other like early mothers and fathers of the church. Did you dig into that in a new way for this book? I mean, is that a new interest? Is it something that sustains you when you're feeling like our current church is, such a bad witness? We can look back at these people hundreds of years ago and learn so much from them.
Yeah, I bet you they would have said that too about their own church. That's why they're out in the desert. So we have our different problems, and our times, and some are the same. My first book, I looked back, the Desert Fathers and Mothers and the Saints of the Eastern Catholic, and I read Episcopalians too. Just anyone that's like following Jesus in faith and action, really strengthens me and helps me to know that I'm not alone. Like I know there's other people here too, and I read people's current works and books too, but I really think of the church as a cloud of witnesses, which would include we would say those not living in this life, but they're living. I think of saints that have passed away. I think of Rachel Held Evans and Dallas Willard. I mean, and Oscar Romero, who I'm reading, Bishop Oscar Romero. And so like Harriet Tubman, who's the movie that that was out recently, and I went to visit a museum in Maryland at one point, and just African American brothers and sisters, minorities, white, all. I feel like I'm part of this huge big thing, and what an impoverished soul I would have and an imagination if I only stuck to the people that were alive, which I do. I read your work, I read other people's work that really informs me, but I think we're all part of a great cloud of witnesses.
I love the way you put that. I completely agree. And I think sometimes too, it can be such a sort of palate cleanser and a reminder too that we are part of something bigger. If we're stuck on our phones and we're like scrolling through news and feeling so kind of mired in the present moment, it's great to remember that people lived and died and were faithful before us. And, we can we can be present and also gain some kind of hope and encouragement from people in that cloud of witnesses. I love the way you put that.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
glad I feel that same way.
yeah. Um, so I don't want to take too much more of your time. I know you have other things that you need to do. And lastly, tell us about what you're starting this fall.
Oh yeah. Like in a week and a half, I am starting a PhD program in American Culture Studies at Bowling Green State University. It's about 20 minutes south of us. And I'm studying evangelicals, immigration, race, and poverty. I said maybe gender. Like I have a grand plans, but I'm sure I'm gonna really have to narrow it down. But I have an idea, and I want to zoom in, zone in on what is like cultural. Like, people say, well, we have the biblical stance. Like, is it, or how much have you been influenced by white supremacy or culture? Like, I really want to dig into that. And because I have a really hard time understanding, I'm sure with the people that you've talked to in this series, but like how people could claim to read the Bible and follow Jesus, but oppress the people that Jesus made a beeline to. And I care about that so much that I'm studying it.
Right, right. I'm excited to read your someday dissertation.
Oh yes, please, in Jesus' name, may I do it.
You will. I have every confidence you
Oh,
will.
thank you.
Yeah. Well, Marlena, this has been a delight. Thank you so much. And we'll put your website up and everything else so that people can follow you and join in conversation with you, especially on Twitter. I know you love Twitter, so it's awesome.
Thank you so much, and the best to you, Jen, and all the others in this series. I'm glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you.